The night had always been Mark Johnson's preferred time of day. Cleveland streets, bathed in the dim glow of amber streetlights, provided a kind of solitude he found oddly comforting. At 25, his life was a balancing act between mundane obligations and secret ambitions. By day, he was a pizza delivery driver, weaving through traffic in his beaten-up, rust-streaked sedan. The vehicle was a patchwork of dents and peeling paint, a testament to years of wear and neglect. It rattled faintly whenever he revved the engine, but Mark knew every quirk of its operation. To him, it was a trusty companion, dependable despite its flaws. Mark's shifts were demanding, especially during peak hours. Fridays, in particular, were brutal. The city buzzed with life, and the demand for piping hot pizzas seemed endless. Yet, he never faltered. His punctuality and polite demeanor had earned him a reputation among regular customers, many of whom greeted him with warm smiles and generous tips. It wasn't unusual for him to drive into unfamiliar neighborhoods, some far from the city center, delivering pizzas with his usual mix of efficiency and cheerfulness. But Mark's true nature remained hidden beneath this ordinary routine. Few would guess that the soft-spoken man who handed over pizzas with a friendly smile was also an accomplished mixed martial artist. Each evening, after his work shift, he swapped his delivery uniform for athletic gear, trading the pizza boxes for punching bags and sparring partners. He trained at a modest gym on the outskirts of the city, a place as unassuming as his car. Inside, however, was a world of grit and determination. Coach Harris, a grizzled ex-fighter with a permanent scowl etched onto his face, ran the gym with an iron fist. Beneath his gruff exterior was a mentor who saw promise in Mark from the moment he'd first stepped through the gym's doors. Mark had been just 17 then, a wiry teenager with haunted eyes and a burning desire to prove himself. Over 8 years, he transformed from an eager novice to a technical powerhouse, mastering the intricacies of striking, grappling, and submission holds. For Mark, MMA wasn't about aggression or dominance, it was a discipline. What began as a means of self-defense against schoolyard bullies had evolved into a philosophy. The sport taught him control, respect, and resilience, qualities that extended beyond the octagon. His mantra was simple: strength was for protection, not for harm. Yet, his dedication to the craft was undeniable. Every kick, every punch, every takedown reflected years of meticulous training and unwavering focus. His humility often puzzled his sparring partners. Mark was the kind of guy who stayed late to clean up the gym, offered pointers to newcomers, and never boasted about his achievements. In a world where fighters often flaunted their skills, he remained an enigma. His colleagues respected him, though they struggled to reconcile the reserved delivery driver with the fierce competitor who dominated sparring sessions. Coach Harris saw in Mark a rare blend of talent and humility. "Kid," he'd often say, "you've got what it takes to go pro if you want. You just gotta let people see it." Mark would smile, offering his usual non-committal shrug. He respected Harris's belief in him but wasn't ready to abandon the responsibilities that tethered him to his current life. Those responsibilities were the anchor that kept Mark grounded. His mother, Ellen, had been battling a chronic illness for years, leaving her frail and often bedridden. Despite her condition, she remained the emotional center of the family, her gentle humor and unshakable optimism inspiring Mark and his younger brother, Nathan. At 15, Nathan was a typical high school sophomore, brimming with energy and dreams but still dependent on his older brother for guidance. The two shared a close bond, with Mark often stepping into a parental role when Ellen's health took a turn for the worse. Their modest home in Cleveland was a constant reminder of their struggles. The peeling wallpaper, creaky floorboards, and mismatched furniture told a story of a family that made do with what they had. Mark worked tirelessly to cover medical bills, rent, and Nathan's school expenses, often taking extra shifts at the pizza shop when things got tight. It was exhausting, but he never complained. Sacrifice, to Mark, was an expression of love. One evening, after finishing a grueling delivery run, Mark parked his car in the driveway and leaned back in the driver's seat, exhaling deeply. The soft hum of the engine faded as he turned off the ignition. The house was quiet, save for the faint glow of a television flickering through the living room window. He entered quietly, careful not to wake Ellen, who had finally fallen asleep after a difficult day. Nathan was sprawled on the couch, his textbooks and gaming console competing for space on the coffee table. "You're back late," Nathan mumbled without looking up, his voice heavy with sleep. "Yeah, busy night," Mark replied, ruffling his brother's hair as he passed. "Go to bed. You've got school tomorrow." As Nathan grumbled his way up the stairs, Mark grabbed a bottle of water and slumped into a chair at the kitchen table. He stared at his hands, calloused and bruised from hours at the gym, and wondered how long he could keep up this relentless pace. The weight of his dual life often felt overwhelming, but quitting wasn't an option. For his family, he would endure. Later that night, Mark arrived at the gym, his tiredness melting away as he stepped onto the mats. The familiar scent of sweat and disinfectant greeted him, along with the rhythmic thuds of fists hitting punching bags. This was his sanctuary, the one place where he could channel his frustrations and focus solely on the present. As he warmed up, Coach Harris approached, his expression unreadable. "Mark," he began, his voice low, "you're good, damn good. But talent means nothing if you don't take risks. When are you gonna stop hiding and start fighting for real?" Mark hesitated, the weight of Harris's words settling on his shoulders. "I fight every day," he replied, his tone even. "Just not in the way you mean." Harris studied him for a moment before nodding. "Fair enough, kid. But remember, the world doesn't wait forever." Mark returned to his drills, pushing the thought aside. For now, his focus was on perfecting the next strike, the next block, the next takedown. The future could wait. As the hours passed, the gym emptied out, leaving Mark alone with his thoughts. He stood in the center of the ring, the dim light casting long shadows across the mats. The silence was soothing, but it also amplified the questions that lingered in the back of his mind. What was he fighting for? Was it enough to protect his family and maintain his routine, or was there something more waiting for him beyond the boundaries of this life? Mark didn't have the answers yet, but he knew one thing for certain. When the time came to face those questions, he'd be ready. For now, he was content to exist in the space between, a warrior hidden in plain sight, delivering pizzas by day and chasing shadows by night. Friday nights were chaos. The phones at Tony's Pizza never seemed to stop ringing, and Mark Johnson was at the center of it all. Boxes piled high in the cramped kitchen, each one labeled with an address and a scribbled timestamp. The delivery team was stretched thin, but Mark thrived in the pressure. He moved quickly, loading pizzas into his car with the efficiency of someone who'd been doing this for years. The rusted sedan groaned under the weight of the thermal bags as Mark slammed the trunk shut. "Mark, I need you to take this one," Tony called out from behind the counter, waving another ticket in the air. "It's out by Hawthorne Street." Mark paused, his brow furrowing. Hawthorne was a notoriously run-down area on the outskirts of Cleveland, a place he rarely ventured into. The streetlights there were sparse, and the sidewalks often littered with debris. Still, he nodded without hesitation, slipping the slip of paper into his pocket. "Got it, Tony," he said, grabbing the last box from the counter. He didn't complain about the extra work. He never did. The drive to Hawthorne was uneventful at first. The city's familiar streets gradually gave way to darker, quieter roads. The faint hum of his car's engine was the only sound as he navigated the poorly lit neighborhood. Mark checked the address again, ensuring he was on the right street. The house he pulled up to was dark, its exterior weathered and unkempt. The porch light was out, and the windows were hidden behind heavy curtains. He double-checked the address and sighed. This was the place. Mark grabbed the pizza and stepped out of the car, the cold night air biting at his skin. The street was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made his instincts tingle. He walked up the cracked pathway to the front door, his boots crunching softly against the loose gravel. As he raised a hand to knock, a faint rustling sound caught his attention. He turned, scanning the shadows. 3 figures emerged from the darkness, their movements casual but calculated. They were young, dressed in worn hoodies and jeans. Mark's gaze flicked to their hands, empty but clenched tightly. Something about their posture set him on edge. "Hey there," one of them said, stepping forward. He was taller than the others, with a cocky smirk and a scar running down his jaw. "You're a little lost, aren't you?" Mark kept his expression neutral, shifting his weight slightly to maintain balance. "Just delivering pizza," he said evenly, holding up the box as if to prove his point. The scarred man chuckled, glancing back at his companions. "Yeah. Well, how about you deliver your wallet, too?" The tension in the air thickened. Mark's heart rate quickened, but outwardly he remained calm. He placed the pizza on the ground carefully, his mind already calculating distances and escape routes. "Look, I don't want any trouble," he said, his tone firm but non-confrontational. "Trouble?" Another one sneered, stepping closer. This one was shorter but stockier, his fists clenched tight. "You're the one who's in trouble." Scarred Jaw lunged first, his movements sloppy but aggressive. Mark reacted instinctively, stepping aside and grabbing the man's wrist. With a swift twist and a calculated sweep of his leg, Scarred Jaw hit the ground with a heavy thud. The other two hesitated, their confidence visibly shaken. "Back off," Mark said, his voice low and commanding. He didn't want to escalate the situation, but his adrenaline was spiking. The stocky one charged next, throwing a wild punch aimed at Mark's face. Mark ducked smoothly, countering with a precise jab to the ribs that sent his attacker staggering backward. A quick kick to the side of the knee had him down on one knee, gasping for breath. The third figure, a lanky teen with wide eyes, froze in place. "Kevin, let's get out of here," he shouted, panic lacing his voice. When Kevin, the stocky one, didn't respond, the teen turned and sprinted into the shadows. Mark stood still for a moment, his chest heaving. Scarred Jaw groaned from the ground, clutching his wrist, while Kevin struggled to regain his footing. Neither made any further moves to attack. "You don't have to do this," Mark said, addressing both men. His voice was calm but firm. "Walk away." "No." Scarred Jaw muttered a curse under his breath, dragging himself to his feet. He glared at Mark but didn't move to attack again. Kevin followed suit, his posture slumped in defeat. Together, they limped away into the night, leaving Mark alone on the deserted street. He exhaled slowly, the tension in his muscles easing slightly. The fight had lasted less than a minute, but his body still buzzed with the residual adrenaline. He picked up the pizza from where he'd set it down, brushing off the specks of gravel. The door behind him creaked open. Mark turned to see a middle-aged man peering out cautiously, his expression a mix of curiosity and concern. "Is everything okay out here?" the man asked, his voice hesitant. "Yeah," Mark replied, offering a faint smile. "Just some kids messing around. Here's your pizza." The man looked at him closely, taking in the faint scratches on Mark's hands and the tension in his posture. "You sure you're all right? You look like you've been through something." "I'm fine," Mark said quickly, handing over the box. The man accepted it reluctantly, his gaze lingering on Mark for a moment longer before retreating inside. As Mark walked back to his car, his mind raced. He'd acted on instinct, relying on years of training to protect himself. But the confrontation left a bitter taste in his mouth. He hated using violence, even when it was justified. The philosophy coach Harris had drilled into him echoed in his mind: control, always. Never escalate unless you have no other choice. Back in the safety of his car, Mark gripped the steering wheel tightly. The encounter had been a stark reminder of the world's unpredictability. For years, he'd managed to keep his two lives separate: the humble pizza delivery guy and the disciplined fighter. Tonight, they'd collided, and he wasn't sure how to reconcile that. As he drove away, the faint hum of the engine filled the silence. His reflection in the rearview mirror looked the same, but something in his chest felt heavier. This wasn't the life he'd envisioned for himself, but it was the one he had to navigate. And he knew this was just the beginning. The night was still heavy on Mark's mind as he parked his car in the driveway, its old frame creaking under the strain of yet another long shift. The faint glow of the living room light spilled through the curtains, a comforting sign that someone was awake. He rubbed his temples, trying to shake off the lingering adrenaline from the encounter on Hawthorne Street. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Scarred Jaw's twisted expression and Kevin's panicked retreat. The echoes of their threats still clung to the edges of his thoughts. As Mark stepped inside, He was greeted by the soft murmur of the television and the familiar warmth of home. Nathan was sprawled on the couch, his legs tangled in a blanket, half asleep as an old action movie played on the screen. Mark set his keys on the counter and quietly filled a glass of water. "You're back late," Nathan mumbled, not bothering to open his eyes. Mark hesitated, gripping the edge of the sink. "Yeah. Long shift," he replied, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. Nathan rolled over, his words slurring with exhaustion. "You good?" "Always," Mark said with a faint smile, watching as his brother slipped into deeper sleep. But he wasn't good. Far from it. Upstairs, in the quiet of his small bedroom, Mark sat on the edge of his bed and stared at his bruised knuckles. They weren't new to him. Training had given him plenty of scars over the years, but these felt different. They weren't earned in the gym or during a sparring session. They were a product of necessity, of survival, and that distinction weighed heavily on him. The next morning, Mark was up early, his body moving on autopilot. He brewed coffee and packed Nathan's lunch before heading to the gym. His mother's door was still closed, the soft hum of her medical equipment a constant background noise. He peeked in to check on her, reassured by her peaceful expression. It was moments like this that reminded him why he worked so hard. At the gym, the atmosphere was the same as always, gritty and full of determination. Coach Harris barked orders from across the room, his gravelly voice cutting through the thuds of fists against heavy bags. Mark warmed up silently, his mind elsewhere. "Johnson," Harris called, snapping him out of his daze. "What's with the zoning out? You're better than that." Mark forced a smile. "Just tired, coach. Long shift last night." Harris squinted at him, his sharp eyes catching something beneath the surface. He didn't press, though, simply nodding before motioning toward the sparring ring. "Get in there. Focus up." Mark nodded, pulling on his gloves. The familiar ritual of sparring grounded him, forcing his attention to the present. His opponent, a lean fighter with quick reflexes, tested his patience with feints and swift jabs. But Mark's movements were sharper, more deliberate. Each punch, block, and counter was executed with precision, the result of years of training. Still, Harris wasn't satisfied. After the session, he pulled Mark aside. "All right, kid, spill it. What's eating at you?" Mark hesitated, debating whether to open up. Harris wasn't just his coach. He was a mentor, someone who had seen Mark at his worst and pushed him to be better. But this felt different. "Just had a rough night," Mark finally said, his tone dismissive. Harris crossed his arms, unimpressed. "You're not the type to let a rough night throw you off. Talk to me." Mark sighed, relenting under the older man's scrutiny. "I ran into some trouble on a delivery. Couple of guys thought they could jump me. Didn't go how they planned." Harris's expression darkened, his jaw tightening. "You all right?" "I'm fine," Mark assured him. "Handled it." "Handling it isn't the point," Harris said, his voice low but firm. "You're not out there to prove anything, Mark. You're out there to keep your head down and get home safe. Don't let anyone drag you into their mess." Mark nodded, but the weight of the conversation lingered. He knew Harris was right. The confrontation hadn't been about proving strength, it was about survival. But it still left a mark, a lingering unease that gnawed at him. Later that day, Mark found himself driving aimlessly through the city, his mind replaying the events on Hawthorne Street. He didn't feel like a hero or even a fighter. He felt conflicted. He thought about Scarred Jaw and Kevin, wondering what circumstances had led them to that dark street and that desperate act. Were they just victims of their environment, or had they made choices that brought them there? As the afternoon sun dipped below the skyline, Mark pulled into the parking lot of a community center. It wasn't a place he frequented, but he'd heard about its outreach programs for troubled youth. A quiet thought nagged at him. Could he have done something differently? Could he have reached out instead of striking back? Inside, the center was bustling with activity. Kids of all ages filled the space, playing games, working on art projects, and chatting with volunteers. Mark lingered near the entrance, watching from a distance. He wasn't sure what he was looking for. Maybe just a sense of purpose, something to counterbalance the doubts in his mind. "Can I help you?" A woman's voice broke through his thoughts. She was tall and confident, her tone curious but not intrusive. Mark hesitated before answering. "Just looking around. Heard about the place." She nodded, her expression softening. "It's a good spot. We try to keep the kids off the streets, give them something to focus on." "You interested in volunteering?" The question caught him off guard. "I'm not sure," he admitted. "Just trying to figure some things out." She smiled, handing him a flyer. "Well, if you change your mind, we're always looking for mentors. These kids could use someone who's been through the fight and come out the other side." Mark stared at the flyer as she walked away, her words echoing in his mind. He didn't feel like someone who'd come out the other side, but maybe that was the point. Maybe he wasn't supposed to have it all figured out. Maybe just trying was enough. As he left the center, the weight on his shoulders felt slightly lighter. The doubts hadn't disappeared, but they felt manageable. For now, that was enough. Mark drove home, the city's lights blurring in his rearview mirror, and resolved to keep moving forward, one step, one fight, one delivery at a time. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly in the gym as Mark stepped onto the mat, the familiar scent of sweat and disinfectant grounding him. He had spent countless hours here, perfecting every move, every strike, every step. But tonight, the atmosphere felt different, as though something unseen lingered in the air. The incident on Hawthorne Street had not faded from his thoughts, and though Mark tried to focus on the rhythmic motions of his warm-up, the memory of the confrontation clung stubbornly to the edges of his mind. "Johnson, pick it up!" Coach Harris barked from the corner, his gruff voice cutting through the hum of the gym. Mark complied without hesitation, his punches hitting the bag with renewed intensity. Each strike echoed with a dull thud, but even the physical exertion couldn't drown out the nagging questions swirling in his head. What if he had been slower? What if they had been armed? What if... The gym door creaked open, drawing Mark's attention. A young man stepped inside hesitantly, his frame thin but wiry, his face partially obscured by the hood of his sweatshirt. Mark recognized him immediately. It was Kevin, one of the would-be attackers from that fateful night. The realization hit him like a cold wave, and his muscles tensed instinctively. Kevin's presence felt like an anomaly, a collision of two worlds Mark had worked hard to keep separate. Coach Harris noticed the newcomer and strode over, his commanding presence filling the space. "Can I help you, kid?" he asked, his tone measured but direct. Kevin glanced around nervously before pulling his hood back, revealing a face marked by faint bruises and deep uncertainty. I'm here to train," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I signed up last week." Mark's heart raced as he watched the exchange, his mind racing with questions. Why here? Why now? Did Kevin know Mark trained at this gym, or was it just a coincidence? The air between them felt charged, as though the gym itself held its breath. Harris scrutinized Kevin for a moment, his sharp eyes missing nothing. "All right," he said finally, jerking his thumb toward the changing rooms. "Get your gear on. First class starts in 5. Kevin nodded quickly and disappeared into the back. Mark stood frozen, his hands still wrapped and ready for sparring, but his focus shattered. Harris noticed and walked over, his voice low. "You know that kid?" Mark hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah. Ran into him the other night on a delivery. Things didn't go well." Harris raised an eyebrow but didn't press for details. "Well, he's here now. Let's see what he's made of. You good with that?" Mark exhaled slowly, nodding again. "Yeah, I'm good." Kevin emerged moments later, his posture awkward and uncertain in the borrowed gym gear. Harris wasted no time, throwing him into basic drills with a group of other newcomers. Mark watched from the sidelines, studying Kevin's movements. The kid was unpolished, his punches sloppy and his footing unsteady, but there was a raw determination in his efforts. He didn't quit, even when the exercises pushed him to the brink of exhaustion. By the end of the session, Kevin was drenched in sweat and visibly drained, but he hadn't given up. Harris clapped him on the shoulder as the group dispersed. "Not bad for your first day," he said gruffly. "Come back tomorrow. We'll see if you've got the guts to stick it out." Kevin nodded, his breath coming in ragged gasps. As he gathered his things, he noticed Mark watching him from across the room. Their eyes met briefly, and Kevin's expression shifted from exhaustion to unease. He hesitated, then walked over, his steps tentative. "Hey," Kevin said, his voice low. I know who you are. From the other night." Mark didn't respond immediately, his face unreadable. "What are you doing here, Kevin?" he asked finally, his tone steady but firm. Kevin shuffled his feet, his gaze dropping to the floor. "Look, I didn't know you'd be here. I swear. I needed to find something else, something to keep me out of trouble." Mark studied him closely, searching for any sign of dishonesty. But Kevin's discomfort seemed genuine, his words carrying a weight that couldn't be faked. "You got a lot to make up for," Mark said quietly. "But this is a good place to start." Kevin nodded, relief flickering across his face. "I'm sorry," he said, the words stumbling out. "For what happened. For what we tried to do. I was just desperate." Mark's expression softened slightly, though he kept his tone measured. Desperation doesn't excuse bad choices. But it doesn't have to define you, either. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Kevin nodded again, his shoulders straightening slightly. "I'll prove it," he said, his voice stronger this time. Mark didn't reply immediately, letting the silence speak for itself. Finally, he extended a hand. "We'll see," he said simply. Kevin hesitated for a fraction of a second before shaking Mark's hand firmly. It wasn't an apology, not entirely, but it was a start. As Kevin left the gym, Mark watched him go, the encounter stirring a mix of emotions he couldn't quite name. "Kid's got guts," Harris said from behind him, his tone neutral but not unkind. Mark nodded slowly. "Yeah. Let's see what he does with them." The rest of the night passed uneventfully, but Mark's mind lingered on Kevin's unexpected appearance. The gym had always been a place of discipline and growth, a sanctuary from the chaos of the outside world. Now, it seemed to be something more, a crossroads, a place where paths collided and new directions were forged. As Mark drove home, the city lights flickering in his rearview mirror, he felt a faint glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, the encounter on Hawthorne Street hadn't been just another fight. Perhaps it was the start of something larger, something neither he nor Kevin could fully understand yet. And for the first time in days, Mark felt a sense of peace, however fleeting, knowing that change, real change, might be possible. Weeks passed, and Kevin became a regular at the gym. The once tentative steps he'd taken on his first day were replaced by a determination that even Coach Harris began to acknowledge. Though his movements were still raw and unrefined, Kevin's resilience was undeniable. He showed up every evening, enduring grueling drills and punishing sparring sessions without complaint. The other trainees began to notice too, their initial skepticism about the scrawny newcomer softening into respect. Mark observed Kevin's progress from a distance. He kept his interactions professional, answering Kevin's questions during training and offering occasional pointers. But he remained wary. Trust wasn't something Mark gave easily, especially not to someone who had once tried to rob him. Still, there was a quiet satisfaction in seeing Kevin channel his energy into something productive. One evening, as the gym emptied out, Kevin lingered behind, wiping down equipment. Mark was packing up his gear when Kevin approached, his expression hesitant but resolute. "Mark," Kevin began, his voice steady. "I wanted to thank you." Mark paused, slinging his bag over his shoulder. "For what?" "For not writing me off," Kevin said, meeting Mark's gaze. "You could have told Coach Harris what happened that night. You could have gotten me kicked out of here. But you didn't." Mark studied him for a moment, his face unreadable. "I didn't do it for you," he said finally. "This gym is about giving people a chance to be better. What you do with that chance is on you." Kevin nodded, accepting the words without argument. "I get that. I want you to know I'm trying. Really trying." Mark softened slightly, though his tone remained measured. Good. Keep showing up. That's how you prove it. Kevin smiled faintly, the weight of Mark's approval evident in his posture. As he turned to leave, he hesitated. There's something I should tell you, he said, his voice quieter now. Nick's been asking about you. The name sent a jolt through Mark. Nick had been the second man on Hawthorne Street, the one whose desperation had turned into aggression. Mark hadn't seen or heard from him since that night, and he had hoped it would stay that way. What does he want? Mark asked, his tone even but sharp. Kevin sighed, his expression conflicted. He's not in a good place. He's angry, mostly at himself, but he's taking it out on everyone else. He blames you for what happened. Mark's jaw tightened. He'd seen this before, the cycle of blame, the refusal to take responsibility for one's actions. And what about you? He asked. Do you blame me? Kevin shook his head. No. You were right to do what you did. I see that now. But Nick, he's not ready to see it. Mark exhaled slowly, the weight of the situation settling over him. Tell him this, if he wants to talk, I'm here. But if he's looking for a fight, he won't like how it ends. Kevin nodded, though his unease was clear. I'll try to get through to him. The conversation lingered in Mark's mind as he drove home. He didn't regret defending himself that night, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the consequences were far from over. People like Nick didn't just let things go, and Mark knew he would have to stay vigilant. The next day, Mark arrived at the gym to find a surprising scene. Kevin was sparring with another trainee, his movements sharper and more controlled than Mark had seen before. Coach Harris stood nearby, nodding approvingly as Kevin executed a clean takedown. Not bad, kid, Harris called as Kevin helped his partner back to his feet. You keep this up, you might actually be worth something. Kevin grinned, the rare compliment fueling his confidence. Mark watched from the sidelines, a faint sense of pride stirring within him. Kevin was proving that change was possible, even for someone who had once been lost. But the moment of calm didn't last. That evening, as Mark left the gym, he spotted a familiar figure leaning against the side of his car. Nick. His presence was unmistakable, the same stocky build, the same tense energy. But there was something different about him now, a hardness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Mark, Nick said, his voice low and edged with bitterness. We need to talk. Mark approached cautiously, keeping his hands loose and ready. This isn't the place for that. Nick laughed humorlessly, pushing off the car. No. Because it looks like the perfect place to me. Mark studied him, noting the clenched fists and the subtle shift in his stance. What do you want, Nick? Nick's expression darkened. I want you to know what you did to me. You humiliated me. Made me look weak. You made yourself look weak, Mark said calmly. You made a choice that night, and it didn't work out. That's on you. Nick's face twisted with anger, and for a moment, Mark thought he might swing. But instead, Nick took a step back, his voice dropping to a growl. You think you're better than me? Because you know how to fight. You're just a delivery guy with a chip on his shoulder. Mark didn't flinch. I don't think I'm better than anyone. But I do know this. Blaming me won't fix your problems. If you want to do something about your life, start with yourself. Nick scoffed, shaking his head. You don't get it. You never will. With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Mark standing alone in the dim light of the parking lot. The tension in the air lingered long after Nick disappeared into the shadows. Back at home, Mark sat in silence, his mind replaying the encounter. He couldn't save everyone, he knew that. But for Kevin, for others like him, there was hope. And as long as there was hope, Mark would keep showing up. For his family, for the gym, and for himself. The air in the gym buzzed with a quiet tension. It was late, and most of the regulars had already left, leaving only Mark, Kevin, and Coach Harris finishing their nightly routines. The hum of the fluorescent lights and the rhythmic creak of punching bags swinging on their chains provided a familiar backdrop, but there was an undercurrent of unease that Mark couldn't shake. His encounter with Nick the previous night lingered in his mind, a shadow he couldn't ignore. Kevin had been making remarkable progress. Each punch he threw, each block he executed, carried a newfound precision and confidence. Mark had to admit that the kid had worked hard to earn his place. But even as Kevin landed a clean combination on a heavy bag, his brow furrowed, and he turned to Mark. "Nick's not letting this go," Kevin said, wiping sweat from his forehead. "I talked to him again. He's angrier than ever." Mark's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice steady. "What's he planning?" Kevin hesitated, his eyes darting away before answering. He didn't say outright, but he mentioned tonight. Said he was tired of waiting for you to face him. Mark exhaled slowly, his thoughts sharpening into focus. He had tried to give Nick an out, a chance to take responsibility for his actions and move forward. But it seemed Nick had chosen a different path. "Let him come," Mark said firmly. "If he's looking for a fight, I'll handle it. But I won't let it drag anyone else into his mess." Kevin nodded reluctantly, the worry etched on his face clear. "Just be careful. He's not the same guy you saw that night. He's desperate." As Kevin left, Mark lingered in the gym, methodically wrapping his hands and stretching. He needed the time to clear his head, to steel himself for what might come. Coach Harris, ever perceptive, approached with his arms crossed. "Something's brewing, isn't it?" Harris asked, his gravelly voice low. Mark nodded. "Nick, he's not done." Harris's expression hardened. "You know the rules, kid. You don't let the fight come to you. You take control. Stay ahead of it." "I'll be ready," Mark said, his tone unwavering. Harris studied him for a moment longer before giving a curt nod. "You'd better be." The night outside was colder than usual, a sharp wind cutting through the streets of Cleveland. Mark stepped out of the gym, his breath visible in the frigid air. He didn't have to wait long. A figure emerged from the shadows across the street, his gait tense and deliberate. "Nick." Mark squared his shoulders, standing his ground as Nick approached. The streetlight above cast harsh shadows on Nick's face, accentuating the fury in his eyes. "I told you this wasn't over," Nick said, his voice tight with anger. "It doesn't have to be this way," Mark replied evenly. "Walk away, Nick. Let it go." Nick shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping him. "You don't get it, do you? Guys like me don't get to let things go. We don't get second chances. People like you, guys who have it all together, you think you're better than us." Mark frowned, his voice firm but calm. "I'm not better than you. I've made my share of mistakes. But blaming me for your problems won't fix them. You're the only one who can." Nick took a step closer, his hands clenched into fists. "You don't know anything about me." "I know enough," Mark said. "I know you're angry, and you think this will make it better. But it won't. All it'll do is make it worse." For a moment, Nick hesitated. Mark saw the flicker of doubt in his eyes, a crack in the armor of rage. But it vanished as quickly as it appeared. Nick lunged, his fist flying toward Mark's face. Mark moved instinctively, sidestepping the attack and deflecting Nick's arm. He didn't retaliate, didn't throw a punch. Instead, he kept his stance defensive, his voice steady. "Stop this, Nick. You don't want to do this." But Nick didn't stop. He swung again, his punches wild and fueled by frustration. Mark dodged each one, his movements precise and measured. He didn't want to hurt Nick, not unless he had no choice. As the fight dragged on, Nick's movements grew sloppier, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Mark saw his opportunity and stepped in, grabbing Nick's arm and twisting it into a controlled lock. He pushed Nick down to the ground, pinning him without causing unnecessary harm. "Enough," Mark said firmly, his voice cutting through the cold night air. "This isn't who you want to be." Nick struggled for a moment before going still, the fight draining out of him. Mark released him and stepped back, his breathing steady. Nick sat on the pavement, his head in his hands, the weight of his choices finally catching up to him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The street was silent save for the distant hum of traffic. Finally, Nick looked up, his face a mix of anger, shame, and exhaustion. "I don't know how to fix it," he admitted quietly. Mark crouched down, meeting Nick's gaze. "You start by admitting you need help. Then you take it one step at a time. It's not easy, but it's worth it." Nick didn't respond, but the faintest glimmer of understanding flickered in his eyes. Mark stood and offered a hand. After a moment, Nick took it, pulling himself to his feet. "You've got a long road ahead," Mark said. "But you're not alone. There's a place that can help, if you're willing to try." Nick nodded, the bitterness in his expression softening. "I'll think about it." As Nick walked away, Mark watched him go, a sense of cautious hope settling over him. He knew Nick's journey was far from over, but this was a start. And sometimes, a start was all it took. Mark turned and headed home, the city's lights guiding his path. For the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of closure. He had faced the storm, not with fists but with resolve, and emerged stronger for it. And though the road ahead remained uncertain, Mark knew he was ready for whatever came next.
If you enjoyed the story and want to see more content like this, support the channel by subscribing, liking, and turning on notifications.